So last week, the Department of Justice dropped over 3 million pages of Epstein files. Emails, photos, vacation pictures, the whole thing. They called it the final word on this scandal. Spoiler alert, it was not. The first thing you notice reading through this stuff is just how many famous names are in there. 2 US presidents, British royals, basically every big shot in finance and business. And a lot of people who said they barely knew the guy turn out to have been way closer than they ever admitted. The actual release was a complete disaster. Day 1, there was a download all button that let journalists grab everything at once. The second the government figured out people were actually using it, they killed it. After that, you had to download files one by one. Documents were appearing and then disappearing. You'd read something, go back the next day, and it was just gone. One file in particular had a list of FBI tips involving the US president. It became the most talked about PDF on the internet overnight, and then it vanished the next morning and still hasn't come back. The redactions are genuinely insane. The same document got uploaded multiple times with completely different things blacked out each time. In one file, they redacted JP from JP Morgan, apparently to protect the privacy of one of the most famous banks in the world. But then, at the same time, they accidentally published unredacted photos of victims, including people who had never come forward publicly, so they're covering up a bank's name but exposing actual victims. And they still haven't provided written justification for any of the redactions, which they were legally required to do. The first big story to blow up was about Bill Gates. Epstein sent himself these typo-filled emails in 2013 where he claims Gates got an STD from Russian girls and needed antibiotics secretly given to his wife Melinda without her knowing. He also claimed he was supplying Gates with Adderall for bridge tournaments. Gates says none of this is true and called Epstein a disgruntled liar. But if it is true, the real takeaway is that one of the richest men on earth couldn't get a doctor's appointment and had to go to a convicted sex offender for basic medical help. That's the healthcare system working as intended. Now, the really interesting question is, how did Epstein stay untouchable for so long? The original prosecutor on his case, a woman named Villifana, had built an absolutely devastating case against him by 2007. 82 pages laying out the abuse, the money laundering, all of it. She even went after his banks and contacted his biggest client, Les Wexner. Epstein completely panicked, his lawyers went nuclear, and she was pulled off the case. The result was that famous sweetheart deal where he got a few months in a county jail and everyone around him got blanket immunity. Everyone. His entire social circle got protected. Some people say it was his political connections that saved him. He was flying around with Bill Clinton for years. But that theory has a problem. Dennis Hastert was the 6th longest serving Speaker of the House, way more politically connected than Epstein. And when the FBI caught up with him for being a serial child abuser, they didn't give him a deal. They put him in prison on financial technicalities. So connections alone don't explain it. There's another theory that gets a lot more interesting with these new files. One newly released FBI document has a confidential source claiming that Alan Dershowitz told prosecutors that Epstein was connected to both U.S. and Allied intelligence services. The same document claims Epstein trained as a spy under former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, that Dershowitz himself was being debriefed by Mossad after his phone calls with Epstein, and that Trump had been compromised by Israel through Jared Kushner. Now, you have to take all of that with a massive grain of salt because these are unverified intelligence reports. But the FBI was still recording these kinds of allegations as late as October 2020, which suggests the intelligence angle wasn't just people making stuff up online. Now let's talk about some of the specific people caught up in this. Howard Lutnick, who is currently the U.S. Commerce Secretary, lived literally next door to Epstein in Manhattan. He's been on podcasts telling a great story about how he toured Epstein's house once, heard something disgusting, and never went back. What he left out is that he actually bought his house from Epstein for $10. Yes, $10. And the files show emails from 2012 where his family was planning a vacation to Epstein's private island. 4 years after Epstein's guilty plea, 4 years after Lutnick would have legally received a notification that a registered sex offender was living right next door. The eye barely knew him. Defense is a tough sell. When you share a wall, got a New York townhouse for the price of a coffee, and we're booking holidays together. Then there's Elon Musk, who spent years publicly insisting Epstein kept trying to get him to visit the island, but he always turned it down. The files mention his name over 1,000 times. There's an email where Musk is messaging Epstein on Christmas morning, presumably while his kids are opening presents, saying he wants to go out and party, and that a quiet island is the complete opposite of what he's after. Epstein actually warned him that the ratio of women to men might make his then-wife uncomfortable. Musk wrote back that the ratio is not a problem. Musk says the emails are real but misunderstood, and that he never went to the island because of logistics. There's also an email where he's annoyed about being invited to a New York event with diplomats, and Epstein calms him down by saying no one there will be over 25 and everyone is very cute. Prince Andrew, at this point, must be giving King Charles daily anxiety attacks. The files show Epstein was actively lobbying Lutnick to get Andrew a job at Cantor Fitzgerald, a working royal using a convicted sex offender as a recruiter to land a gig at a Wall Street brokerage. Meanwhile, Andrew and Sarah Ferguson somehow thought it was a good idea to invite Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, and Ghilaine Maxwell to their daughter's 18th birthday party. That is some guest list. While all of this was going on, Epstein had a whole operation running to clean up his image. He hired a guy named Al Seckel, who called himself a cognitive scientist but had zero actual qualifications. His main credentials were that he married Ghislaine Maxwell's sister. His job was to bury any article that used words like pedophile and replace them with stories about Epstein, the great philanthropist and science supporter. He actually hacked Epstein's Wikipedia page to swap the arrest mugshot for a nicer photo, and his team celebrated it as a major win. Steve Bannon was involved in filming a sympathetic documentary designed to make Epstein look like a misunderstood financial genius. Woody Allen was apparently going to help edit it. Noam Chomsky, who used to spend weekends at Epstein's place and described them as wonderful, told Epstein in 2019 to just ignore all the press coverage and called it hysteria. One of the most famous intellectuals alive reduced to giving PR advice to a convicted sex offender because the dinner invitations were too good to give up. Richard Branson reportedly suggested a plan where Bill Gates would publicly vouch for Epstein so the rest of the world would fall in line. In Epstein's world, reputation management didn't mean fixing the problem. It meant finding people famous enough to make the problem disappear. Now, the darkest part of all of this. There are documents in these files suggesting Epstein was obsessed with having children to spread his own DNA. An email from Sarah Ferguson to Epstein in 2011 appears to confirm he may have actually had a baby boy. She wrote that she'd heard from Prince Andrew that Jeffrey had a son, and in another email she said she was hurt that he disappeared without even telling her he was having a baby. Then there's a document written by a victim that is one of the most disturbing things in the entire release. She describes being treated as a biological asset, being under Ghislaine Maxwell's complete control, giving birth, and having her baby taken away within 10 to 15 minutes of it being born. She writes that the baby is hers and she wants her back. There is no indication anywhere in the files that law enforcement ever looked into any of it. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, things look very different to what's happening in Washington. Peter Mandelson, one of the most powerful figures in British political history, is now under criminal investigation by the Metropolitan Police for misconduct in public office, which in the UK can carry a life sentence. The files show that while he was a serving government minister, he was emailing Epstein confidential briefings on the 2008 financial crisis, including early confirmation of a €500 billion bailout and details on how the banker bonus tax was going to be designed. That kind of information is worth an enormous amount if you know what to do with it on the markets. Mandelson even had Epstein wire money to his partner for medical treatments and told Epstein to label it as a loan to avoid a gift tax filing. He has already resigned from the Labour Party in the House of Lords. In Slovakia, a foreign minister resigned. In Norway, police launched a corruption investigation into a former prime minister. In Turkey, prosecutors opened an inquiry into child trafficking linked to Epstein's network. Across Europe, people are stepping down, homes are being raided, investigations are opening. In Washington, the official position from the FBI is still that they found no evidence of any wrongdoing by uncharged third parties. The Atlantic Ocean apparently works as a very effective filter for accountability. When a reporter in the Oval Office recently asked Trump what he would say to survivors who feel the redactions are covering up names, he responded by calling her the worst reporter he'd ever seen, said she never smiles, and suggested she was being dishonest. He did not answer the question, and that's kind of where we are. Half the files still haven't been released. The redactions have no written justification, and the people whose names keep coming up are running out of patience with being asked about it. These documents weren't released out of goodwill or a commitment to transparency. They were dragged out by public pressure over many years. The Great Gatsby has that famous line about careless people who smash things up and then retreat back into their money and let other people clean up the mess. But careless is too generous a word for what these files describe. This wasn't carelessness. It was a deliberate, organized, heavily funded system designed to let powerful people do whatever they wanted to vulnerable people and face absolutely no consequences for any of it. Whether those consequences ever actually arrive is still very much an open question. So, we talked about what was in the files, but now the real question is who actually was Jeffrey Epstein, and how does a guy like this even exist in the first place? Because if you just look at him on paper, none of it makes sense. He grew up in a working-class family in Brooklyn. His dad was a parks department worker. He never finished his college degree. He taught briefly at a fancy prep school in New York called Dalton's, got fired, somehow landed a job at Bear Stearns. Through a connection he made there, got pushed out of that too. And then, in the late 80s, he just appears out of nowhere, running his own mysterious financial firm, serving only billionaire clients with a minimum entry of $1 billion. No one could really explain where he came from or how he built that client list so fast. The one person who seems to explain everything is Les Wexner. For those who don't know, Wexner built one of the biggest retail empires in American history. Victoria's Secret, Bath and Body Works, Abercrombie, and Fitch, all his. He is genuinely one of the most successful businessmen of the last 50 years. And for reasons that nobody has ever fully explained, he handed Epstein almost total control of his financial life. Epstein had power of attorney over Wexner's affairs. He moved into Wexner's Manhattan townhouse, the same one that later became the most famous address in the whole scandal. Wexner says he was deceived and that Epstein stole from him, which may well be true. But the level of access Wexner gave one guy, a guy with a murky background and no real credentials, is something that has never been satisfactorily explained. Through Wexner, Epstein got access to a world of wealth and connections that would have taken most people multiple lifetimes to build. And here's where it gets interesting because Epstein clearly understood something that most people don't, which is that at a certain level of wealth and power, the social network is the real currency, not money. The ability to pick up the phone and get someone on the line, the ability to walk into any room in the world and already know half the people there. That is worth more than any investment return. And Epstein was essentially selling access to that network while simultaneously using it to protect himself. The way he worked a room was something people who met him consistently remarked on. He would sit across from some of the smartest, most powerful people in the world and make them feel like they were the most interesting person he had ever spoken to. He had this ability to ask exactly the right question, to remember every detail from the last conversation, to make introductions that felt genuinely useful. Scientists got funding, businessmen got introductions, politicians got access, lawyers got clients, and in return Epstein got deeper and deeper into circles that he had absolutely no business being in. But the thing that kept him truly safe was not charm, it was information. Because when you are the connector, when you are the person through whom all these relationships flow, you end up knowing things. You know who owes money to whom. You know who was at which party. You know what really happened on that trip. And Epstein was meticulous about collecting all of it. The files show cameras everywhere across his properties, hidden recording equipment, a habit of keeping detailed notes on everything. He was not just hosting parties, he was building a library of leverage on some of the most powerful people on the planet. The Leon Black situation is probably the clearest example of how that leverage worked in real life. Black is the co-founder of Apollo Global Management, one of the most powerful private equity firms on earth. By any measure, he is an extremely sophisticated and careful operator, and yet he paid Epstein over $150 million for what a congressional investigation later described as tax advice that was either already publicly available or had already been given to him by his own lawyers. $150 million for advice he did not need. And when Black hesitated before one of those payments, Epstein sent him a reminder that there was a great deal he had already done, some of it known and some things that would need to remain unknown. Black paid up. His lawyers have denied any wrongdoing on his part, but that email is sitting right there in the files for anyone to read. Now the banks knew too, and that is what makes the suspicious activity report such a big deal. These are documents that banks and financial institutions are legally required to file whenever they suspect something criminal is happening with a client's money. They are almost never made public. You cannot get them through a Freedom of Information request. They do not show up in court cases. And yet here they are in the Epstein files showing that major banks were flagging his accounts for suspected human trafficking and money laundering years before he was ever arrested. JP Morgan had executives sitting in internal meetings debating whether to drop him as a client as far back as 2011. They kept him anyway. Did not file a suspicious activity report until 2019, the exact same year he was finally arrested. 8 years of internal concern. 8 years of doing absolutely nothing about it. And this is the pattern that comes up again and again throughout this entire story. People knew, not suspected, not had a vague, uncomfortable feeling about, actually knew. The Farmer sisters reported him directly to the FBI back in 1996. That is more than 20 years before he was arrested. The original prosecutor had a complete airtight case ready to go in 2007. Palm Beach police had been building their own file on him for years. Journalists were trying to get stories published, and at every single turn something happened to slow it down, water it down, redirect it, or make it disappear entirely. The reason that pattern keeps repeating comes down to something that is uncomfortable to say out loud, which is that every system we rely on to hold powerful people accountable, law enforcement, the courts, the press, the banks, all of them have pressure points. And someone who knows exactly where those pressure points are and has unlimited resources to push on them can stay protected for an extraordinarily long time. Epstein figured that out earlier and more completely than almost anyone. What the files also make clear is how much deliberate effort went into making sure the general public never quite connected all the dots. It was not just the Wikipedia page swap or the Steve Bannon documentary. It was a sustained and well-funded strategy of drowning out negative coverage with positive stories, keeping enough famous scientists and celebrities and respected intellectuals in his orbit that they would either defend him instinctively or at minimum stay quiet, and making sure that any journalist or broadcaster who tried to tell the truth faced enough pushback to make them think twice before publishing. Ghilaine Maxwell was central to all of it, not just because of what survivors say she did directly, but because she was the person who gave Epstein his social credibility in the first place. Her father, Robert Maxwell, was one of the most powerful media figures in Europe. She came from a world that Epstein could never have accessed on his own, and she opened those doors for him. And everything the survivors have described makes clear she was not standing on the sidelines watching. She was right in the middle of it. The fact that she is currently sitting in a prison cell while virtually every other person whose name appears throughout these thousands of pages is still out there running their businesses, advising governments, sitting on boards, and giving interviews, that is the thing that should be making more people angry than it currently is. Maxwell did not run this operation by herself. Nobody who has spent any serious time reading these documents believes that for a second. And yet the FBI's official position remains that they found nothing that would support opening an investigation into any uncharged third parties. Compare that to Belgium in the 90s. There was a man there named Marc Dutroux, an unemployed electrician who abducted and abused and murdered children. Like Epstein, he had been caught for sex crimes before, served a fraction of his sentence, and immediately went back to it the moment he was free. When he was finally caught in 1996, he claimed he was part of a much bigger network that was supplying girls to powerful and well-connected people. He had money and properties that made no sense for a man with no job. The investigation was genuinely catastrophic. Police searched his house while 2 kidnapped girls were alive and locked in the basement. Officers heard noises they never followed up on. The prosecutor who was actually making progress was pulled off the case and replaced with someone who had barely any experience. The difference between what happened there and what is happening here is that in Belgium, 300,000 people physically walked into the streets to protest how the case was handled. 300,000 people in a country of 10 million. That level of public fury forced a complete top-to-bottom restructuring of how Belgium's law enforcement actually operates. That kind of reckoning has not happened here. The files were not released because anyone in power wanted transparency. They were released because the public pressure became impossible to absorb any longer, and even then they came out half-redacted, millions of pages still missing, and without the written justifications for every redaction that the law explicitly requires. The way the release itself was handled, 3 million pages dropped all at once, with no structure, documents vanishing overnight. The download button quietly removed the moment journalists started actually using it. None of that looks like an organization trying to help people understand what happened. It looks like an organization trying to make sure that understanding remains just out of reach. What these files ultimately give us is not closure. They give us a very detailed and very disturbing map of how power actually protects itself when it needs to. Not through one big dramatic cover-up masterminded by a single villain, but through hundreds of small, quiet decisions made by hundreds of different people, each of whom looked at the situation and calculated that saying nothing was safer than saying something. A banker who keeps a client he knows he should drop. A journalist who softens a story because the pushback is not worth it. A prosecutor who backs down when her superiors tell her to. A supervisor who files the report 8 years too late. None of those individual decisions looks that shocking on its own, but stack them all together over 20 plus years, and what you get is a system that allowed one of the most serious and well-documented and criminal networks in modern history to keep operating in plain sight, while the people at the top of it went to galas and gave TED Talks and got their photos taken with presidents. The survivors who have been fighting to be heard for, in some cases, nearly 3 decades deserve a genuine answer. Not a document dump with half the pages blacked out. Not a press conference saying there is nothing to see here. An actual answer. Whether that ever comes is still, after all of this, completely unclear.